Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. On behalf of Ocean Conservancy, the Environmental Defense Fund, and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, welcome to our session on valuing the treasures of the Mesopelagic Zone. First off, I would like to thank Chile for their hosting our event. Thank you very much. They've been the most gracious hosts. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kathy Andrews. I'm the Chief Conservation Officer of Ocean Conservancy, and I'm happy to be here tonight to talk to you about my recent and new passion for the Mesopelagic Zone. As we all know, COP16 is an important moment for all of us to get the global biodiversity framework moving into implementation at a scope and scale that is called for to address the global biodiversity crisis. And of course, oceans have to be part of that agenda. As you've probably seen around the venue, nature is also included. So the Mesopelagic Zone, for those of you who don't know, it's also called the Ocean Twilight Zone, or the OTZ. It is from a depth of 200 meters to about 1,000 meters, and it is an area of outsized importance for the ocean. And I'm going to tell you why you need to care about Mesopelagic Zone. 4 reasons, and then we'll return to our steam panel. So first off, it has amazing biodiversity. Look at those photos, faces that only a mother could love, and conservationists. There's very little light down there, enormous pressure, so you have these amazing creatures that have evolved and adapted to this remarkable depth. And the Woods Hole has done some amazing science to learn about all the amazing biodiversity that you will hear from the net, but we have just scratched the surface of what we still need to learn about the Mesopelagic Zone. So number one, amazing biodiversity. Number two, there are a staggering number of animals down there. So the Mesopelagic Zone makes up about 20% of the ocean by volume, and there are some estimates where it is 90% of the fish biomass. 90%. That's amazing. It also constitutes the largest daily migration biomass on the planet. So rich biodiversity and a whole bunch of critters. Number three, they are an important feeding ground, the Ocean Pelagic Zone, for lots of other marine species that we are probably all more familiar with. Whales, dolphins, sharks, and commercially important fish species such as tuna and swordfish. Number four, the Mesopelagic Zone plays a remarkably important role in the regulation of our climate by essentially serving as a huge carbon pump of all these critters, moving carbon from the surface of the ocean down into the deep ocean and pulling carbon with it. So we hope that this event will showcase the importance of the OTZ and build support for action to protecting them. To kick things off, it's my pleasure to share a message from a true ocean champion, the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for the Ocean, Ambassador Peter Thompson. He had hoped to be here in person, but logistics got away from us. So.
Well, good evening, good morning. It's about 3 o'clock here in Mexico City. I'm making this message because I must apologize for not being with you this afternoon. My schedule just doesn't allow it. I've got a late departure. Excuse my eyes, I've been on planes for the last 36 hours, jumping around China and Mexican airports. Hey, one of the reasons I'm particularly sad about not getting to the event this afternoon is that I value so much the treasures of the Twilight Zone. I've been passionate about them ever since I first went up to Woods Hole Institute and had them explained to me by the experts up there, this great diurnal migration of life as it fluctuates up from the Mesopelagic Zone only to return when light comes each day. That giant Mexican wave that goes around the world, how fascinating that is for all of us on the planet, really, and we need to get people more aware of it. We're required by the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework to protect at least 30% of terrestrial and inland water areas and marine and coastal areas, especially areas of particular importance to biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services by 2030. It's a tall order. We're required to effectively conserve and manage that 30 by 30. We're called upon to do so through ecologically representative, well-connected and equitably governed systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. And it requires us to ensure that any sustainable use of resources in such areas is fully consistent with conservation outcomes. By any analysis, that's a big order. It's an order which, under normal circumstances, you would not expect to see fulfilled. But we are not challenged by normal circumstances. We're confronted by circumstances entailing the imminent extinction of 1 million species. We're advised by the best of science that if we don't succeed in conserving 30% of the environment, that from 2030 we're going to be witness to a great cascading away of biodiversity on this planet. A cascade into oblivion that may well in due course take with it our own species. We are up to the challenge of 30 by 30, I think. Think? Of course we're up to the challenge. It's a generational justice demand that we are. And so we've got to get on with the job. It's a big job. In reality, 30 by 30 is just a very large procedural task. And indeed, we have performed greater undertakings in shorter times, especially during times of crisis and war. But we've got no time to waste. We've got to set the procedures in motion. Thus, when it comes to protecting 30% of the high seas, we can't sit on our haunches waiting for BB&J to be ratified. We have to get on with the job of identifying the areas of the high seas of particular importance to biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services. We have to carry out the required environmental impact assessments and the stakeholder consultations. And once BB&J has been ratified and its secretariat and procedures established, we must be ready by 2028 and 2029 to formally establish the 30% under international law. When we talk about marine protected areas, we should all accept that we're not talking about just surface waters. We're talking about descending deep through the mesopelagic zone to the hadal zone and the seafloor. To do otherwise would be foolhardy, for everything is connected, especially when it comes to the ocean. We have so much more to do to understand the implications of that statement that I've just made, which is one of the reasons why I'm so encouraged by the great strides being made in ocean science through the UN Decade of Ocean Science. The vast majority of the Ocean Twilight Zone is currently unprotected and is thus vulnerable to exploitation and degradation from threats such as fishing, deep-sea mining, and changing ocean conditions brought on by climate change. Thus, the outcomes of your event today will be keenly followed by all those who see that achieving a totality of 30 by 30 is vital, in the truest sense of that word. I wish you positive, provocative, and productive discussions today. And I'll see you during the week.
Thank you too, Ambassador Thomas. Okay, so let me introduce our esteemed panel. I'm going to introduce them all up front, and then we're just going to roll through the panel. We have tried diligently to keep our talking points short, so we have room for questions from all of you. So please, make note of any questions you have as you hear from the panelists. First will be Dr. Kilpurti Ramakrishna, known the world around Rama, the Director of Marine Policy or Policy Center at Woods Hole. And he will highlight the importance of the mesopelagic zone. He will be followed by Annette Govindarajan, research specialist at Woods Hole, who will talk about the advancements in science and technology that allow them to better understand the Ocean Twilight Zone. And then my colleague who will come next, Chris Garcett, he's the Vice President of Conservation for Ocean Conservancy, and he will talk about emerging threats and opportunities for protection in the near term. And then last but far from least is Dr. Abdul Halim of Environmental Defense Fund. He's the Senior Director of Indonesian Climate Resilient Fisheries, and he will talk about the interconnection between the mesopelagic zone and coastal communities. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Ron.
Thank you very much, Kathy, for this introduction. And I first of all want to share with you all that this collaboration between Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, Ocean Conservancy, and the Environmental Defense Fund started at the Ocean Conference of the UN Ocean Decade in Barcelona. One of the reasons we started that was we have been working on Ocean Twilight Zone at the Oceanographic Institution. In fact, my colleague Anna Govindarajan is going to tell you more about the science of OTZ. But we thought we reached a point where the kind of information that we have is so profoundly important that we need to bring this to the policy arena more proactively and then see how to make the connection between science and public policy. Ambassador Peter Thompson very nicely covered the importance of the Ocean Twilight Zone for not only biodiversity conservation, but for climate as well. And one of the things that he's very fond of saying is that of the Sustainable Development Goals, the number 14, dealing with ocean, is the one that is least funded and least understood, and which is kind of surprising, given the fact that 71% of the planet is ocean. And we call it Earth, planet Earth, but we should actually be calling it the ocean planet. And yet, things that ocean does on a daily basis, that is responsible for 90% of the biosphere, are not incorporated in either the climate negotiations or in the biodiversity conversation. I mean, they are programmatic areas, and it goes on year in and year out. And we have Convention on Biological Diversity taking on more active role in the area beyond national jurisdictions. Now, to complement that, we have the biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, the High Seas Treaty, and Ambassador Thompson talked about 30 by 30. So this is important. But what I thought I would do before I jump into the Ocean Twilight Zone is to quickly show you a short video. If you are in Washington, D.C., I would really encourage you to go into this immersive experience of what it is to be, and probably an experience in real life, but what it is to be in the middle of the Ocean Twilight Zone.
Come on inside with us and check out the Twilight Zone. We're going to enter a super beautiful immersive exhibit all about the Ocean Twilight Zone, the deep layer of the ocean where light just barely touches, between about 200 and 1,000 meters, about 600 to 3,000 feet.
From the very start of the Ocean Twilight Zone project, we wanted there to be an emphasis not just on research and scientific exploration, but also on outreach and engagement and bringing the work that we were doing and the research we were doing to as many people as possible.
I was one of the scientists who worked on ideas for this exhibit. The hope was that we could bring the public, make them aware of this mysterious realm below the surface of the ocean.
It's really only recently that we've started being able to get down to these depths and realize exactly how much life is there. And I feel like in these exhibits here, when you're standing in the middle of it and you just see the life around you, I think that gives it such a great feeling that this isn't just a void, that this dark habitat, there's life and vibrancy.
The number one thing I hope people take away from this exhibit is awareness that one of the biggest habitats on our planet is the Ocean Twilight Zone that most people have never heard of. And it's incredibly important to the health of the ocean, to the health of our planet, to the productivity that we all rely on, and it even helps to regulate the climate of our whole planet. It's such an essential part of planet Earth. And I just want people to know about it, care about it, and help all of us work together to be responsible stewards and take care of it.
This has been a 5-6 year project with the Oceanographic Institution, and it's now the results are obvious. What we do or what we don't do has profound implications. I cannot stress enough what Ambassador Thompson had said about the implications of the Ocean Twilight Zone, but everything that we want to do, all these planetary crises that we're facing, whether it be climate, biodiversity, desertification, etc. And the one other important aspect that we also want to keep in mind is food production and its reliance on that. About 3 billion people depend on what is called the aquatic foods or blue foods. And what we do or don't do with the Ocean Twilight Zone, again, has profound implications for that. So I hope I will be able to come back to some of these issues later on, but I think it's my great pleasure now to pass the microphone to my colleague, Annette Govindarajan, who is really steeped in the science of it, and she's going to share some of her experiences with you.
Thanks so much, Rama, for that introduction. It's my pleasure to talk about this Ocean Twilight Zone project. And from the beginning, one of the key goals was to study the biodiversity of this region, to look at who's living there, how are these animals distributed in space and time, and what are the factors affecting those distributions. These animals are so important to ocean's climate, the Earth's climate, that through their migration and feeding behaviors, they can expedite the flow of carbon from surface waters down to the deep sea. They're integral parts of food webs. And so the findings from our program, as well as the approaches that we used, can really lead right into the key questions we ask now about what areas do we need to conserve and how can we monitor for ocean health. So at the start of the project and in the Ocean Twilight Zone, as well as the deep ocean in general, a lack of knowledge is what impedes our ability for effective conservation. And that lack of knowledge is largely because it's such a difficult place to access, right? And so one of our Ocean Twilight Zone program goals was to make it more accessible. And so we did that using our interdisciplinary team of scientists and engineers. Next slide. We developed a robot called Nezabot that was designed specifically to explore the mid-water, and it can make video. We developed samplers to collect water samples to develop what we call ocean forensics, or environmental DNA, to look at the genetic fingerprints that these animals leave behind, so we can detect their presence without actually having to sample them directly. And so this approach of eDNA is really tractable and scalable in ways that other methods are not. In addition, we're finding with eDNA that we're actually detecting a lot more organisms, a lot more species than we can with the traditional methods. And that's been one of our important findings. Next slide. So again, our OTZ team is very interdisciplinary, and we work closely with Rama and other policy people at WHOI. We put out a review on how our eDNA approach can inform biodiversity for conservation. And many of you may know that in the United States actually just released a national strategy with eDNA, and this was just in June of 2024. And stating, this is a method that is simple, non-invasive, and scalable. And despite being new, it's robust enough to be used for biodiversity conservation. So we believe this approach is an important way forward to achieving our conservation goals. And it's also an approach that it's scalable enough to be used in the deep ocean, but we can also think of it. Maybe some of you have heard the term blue thread from a policy point of view, but I was thinking about it from the term of our interconnected world ocean, as well as the rivers and watersheds that feeds into it. It's all part of one system, and we can use DNA, and we have used it from the headwaters of rivers in the Rocky Mountains down to the Ocean Twilight Zone, and we're on our way to the Mariana Trench, to the deepest part of the world ocean in spring. And, we feel have a lot of momentum, and this is what we can use to make informative conservation decisions. So with that, I'm going to pass this on.
All right. Thank you, Annette. I'm going to shift gears a bit and talk a bit about what we know about emerging threats to the mesopelagic zone. Also, why now is the time for action, and finally, potential opportunities to protect this incredibly important area. So Ambassador Thompson hit on some of the key emerging threats to the Twilight Zone. First is fishing, second is deep sea mining, and third is the implications of climate change and changing conditions, even in a place like the Ocean Twilight Zone, which is not immune from the impacts of climate change. So first, in terms of fishing, you can imagine 90% of the fish biomass on the planet, that's going to attract a lot of attention, right? So there's been a lot of interest in how this area can be fished in order to increase supplies of fish meal and fish oil. And two key drivers of that. One is expansion of the aquaculture industry. And then the second is we're seeing in places like Peru shifts in the distribution and abundance of a species like anchoveta. And so in order to fill the need or the gap in fish meal presented by these shifts, looking at other areas of the ocean that can be exploited. So really, key drivers for fishing that we think will be realized in the not too distant future. The second is deep sea mining. Here, sediment plumes from mining itself have been shown in modeling efforts to impact the Twilight Zone, and this will have implications for mesopelagic species. Not sure exactly how bad that will be, but we know that it will be impactful. And then finally, I mentioned climate change, and we'll learn a lot more about how that is impacting this part of the ocean, as it is, as we all know, the upper parts of the ocean. So in terms of the time now being the time for action and some potential solutions to protect the mesopelagic zone, some of these threats are emerging, as I said. So fishing at scale for species of interest like lanternfish, they haven't started yet. So right now we have a window of opportunity to put effective governance measures in place. And I think we have a very long history with fisheries management globally that if you do not get in front of fishing practices, it's very difficult for management to catch up. And by the time it does, you typically drive these species down to levels that are unhealthy for those populations and unsustainable in terms of the fishery. But in this particular instance, we're not just talking about what's sustainable in terms of these resources, because we've talked about the important roles they play as prey species for tuna, swordfish, etc. The carbon regulation or climate regulation benefits, as well as the biodiversity. So there have been a couple of really important papers pointing out what some of the governance mechanisms are in terms of putting protection in place for the mesopelagic zone. And I'll talk about this kind of in three components. The first is international resolutions to drive awareness and commitments for protection. As has been stated in this presentation, it's potentially the most important part of the ocean that people have never heard of before, right? So we have to first raise awareness of it and get commitments through things like international resolutions, such as the UN General Assembly, International Union for Conservation of Nature, etc. The second is at the high seas level. So the mesopelagic zone is primarily on the high seas. So the regional fishery management organizations are going to be important actors in this. We're fortunate in terms of good timing that when the BBNJ Treaty is ratified and enforced, it adds a really important new tool to the toolbox in terms of biodiversity protection. And so where there are gaps in regional fishery management organization competencies, this can help fill that gap as well as allow us to take a more holistic approach to management and in particular protection of biodiversity. And then the final piece is, of course, actions that individual countries can take within their EEZs. The mesopelagic zone is in country EEZs, and that's an important area that we can make progress in. So with that, I will pass it over to Colleen, which will talk about the importance to coastal communities in mesopelagic zone.
Thank you very much, Chris. So, in addition to the key roles of the mesopelagic zone in the ocean's biological pump, acting as a carbon elevator, transferring organic carbon from surface to the deep oceans, the Ocean Twilight Zone is also critically important for ecosystem functionings. And the species that inhabit this zone play an important role in the marine food webs. In particular, they are food source of pelagic species such as tuna, billfish species, and other high commercial value fisheries. It is this important role at the center of marine food webs that truly resonate with me as a fisheries person from Indonesia, which is the second largest fish producer in the world. We catch annually around 6.4 million metric tons of seafood, value at around $1.5 billion in 2020. And we have a very high dependency on fish as a source of protein and micronutrients, and also a source of livelihoods for more than 3.5 million people in Indonesia. So this central role for fisheries to our economy and way of life means that the sustainability of fisheries resources, and in particular tuna, is of critical importance for coastal communities and the nations of Indonesia. This is why a precautionary approach taken globally to protect the integrity of these mesopelagic zones is necessary. Within the Indonesian territorial waters, the Indonesian Minister of Marine Affairs and Fisheries in 2015 actually has declared a tuna fishing moratorium in a large portion of the Banda Sea, which is the deepest sea within the Indonesian territorial waters, from October to December, intended to protect the breeding and spawning ground of tuna from overfishing. So that's actually an indication of how important of protecting these critical habitats for tuna and tuna-like species is for Indonesian. And this is just when we think about the role of mesopelagic species in supporting key commercial fisheries. When we combine this with knowledge about the roles of the ocean twilight zones in carbon sequestrations, we understand that we need to protect these species for the good of our planet. Therefore, I feel that it is timely now to begin a public discourse about these critical roles of the ocean twilight zones and consider how we might account for protection of this OTZ within the country, nationally determined contributions, and of course, within the national biodiversity strategies and action plan or NBSAPs. Thank you. I'll pass it on to the back.
Thank you to the panel. As promised, we kept it short to allow for questions or comments from the crowd. Is there another question they'd like to pose to Tim? I'm staying away from most important information. Okay, I've got tons of questions.
Yeah, just a quick note. So this is a link to a 2-pager that has more information. We also have a lot of great materials in the back, including one from Whistle, which is an excellent right there.
This and this, you can take the QR code, you will have the report. And then if you go to our website, if you go to our WUI website, there is an Ocean Twilight Zone separate web page. So you will have lots and lots of information, all the documents, research papers that came out of it, and the partners of the OTC.
Please.
Should I
Oh, yes, sorry.
Thank you, panel. My name is Sean Owen. I'm with the DC Conservation Coalition. Thank you for a wonderful set of really complimentary and comprehensive presentations. My question relates to the threats that both Peter and Chris have identified. And I'm curious because the upcoming industry of marine carbon dioxide removal, marine geoengineering, hasn't been mentioned as a threat. And I just wonder why that might be, if this is also on your radar in some way. You want to take it?
Yes, I didn't highlight it here, but in the fact sheet we do talk about it as an issue if done poorly. So it's something we need to understand in terms of implications for the Ocean Twilight Zone before we start to engage in a large scale density on that. So absolutely, it's an issue.
If I may, we know so little about the ocean. We need to get that straight in first and foremost before we do things that irreparably damage the ocean and not have them do what they do for us, for us. So that's vitally important. But focusing on any one particular thing and saying that no matter what, that you shouldn't do that is not going to be helpful. You need to think about I think one thing that I can tell you is it's a question of doing the math. We are unfortunately not in a position to say no to everything and then hope that by just stopping burning fossil fuels, we're going to achieve our goals. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done. We have not done that, and we need to do that. I'd be happy to talk more about it offline. Yeah.
Other questions? Oh, yeah.
Hi, Cleta. I think it's great to see all of you sitting on the stage, spanning, science to, more advocacy groups and conservation. I'm curious if you could talk about kind of the interactions and how you're using the science and what kind of that leads to. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Ocean Conservancy, and I'll let you speak, Murky, science-based organization, right? Evidence-based organization. So the science is critical in terms of what we do. And in this particular case, the knowledge generated by the Ocean Twilight Zone is incredibly important to us. It's part of what makes the case for why we need to protect these areas. And so our organizations got together in April to talk about some of the key findings from the Ocean Twilight Zone and also brought in policy actions to look at, all right, based on what we know, what are some potential avenues to protect this area, as well as I mentioned before, to raise awareness, because it's just out of sight, out of mind for most people, and that has to change.
I just thought I would add to this from a scientific perspective, in that sometimes as scientists we don't get into the policy perspective, but one of the really amazing things about our Ocean Twilight Zone program is that we explicitly included that, right? And so it's been a part of our program from the beginning, and I can say even personally as a scientist that's enriched my professional development as well, and I think there should be more of it.
No, thank you very much. I think the EDF actually has used science as a basis to inform how we develop our programs. And I'm happen to be the representative of EDF in Indonesia. And many of our programs there is actually been, piloting the science. And I think that is where the needs that international NGO like EDF in places like Indonesia need to do better into it, because we can afford to fail, right? And we can learn from, we actually not fail, but we can learn something from there. So in terms of, like how this connection, if you will, the science with the policy, I actually consider myself as a practitioner as well, and it's really very important, that the knowledge, the science generated from research actually can be transferred, if you will, to inform the policy decision-making processes. But we need to make sure that the communication actually flows smoothly. And this is the situation, if you will, that we need to be created, in which the discussion, if you will, is open, and the feedback process is actually available for us to have a positive dialogue, so that we don't kind of fear each other.
Just very briefly, as Kathy introduced me, I'm the director of the Marine Policy Center at the Oceanographic. Now, Oceanographic Institution in Woodsole is the first one in the world to establish a Marine Policy Center back in 1972. And the reason they did it is exactly the question. We do a lot of world-class science, but we don't talk about what the policy connections are. At any given point of time in Woodsole, we have about 800 distinct projects being done. A lot of the scientists don't look at what is the connection to what I'm doing to what the governments around the world are trying to solve. And what we're trying to do, this partnership with EDF and Ocean Conservancy, is exactly that, to take science and take the best science and then see how to connect it to policy across all these things. And the fact that we had not done is as much a blame on us as the government. I complained that climate convention had not incorporated ocean in their deliberation. But we need to make the case why they should pay attention to this.
Thank you. Luis?
Thanks. I got a bit late to the presentation, so my question might be a bit off. But I look a lot at livestock farming, and I at my job, right, and also study-wise. And I think there's a bit of a disconnect at times within their farming practices and just a reflection on the responsibility on the climate agenda. I'm not trying to point fingers, but it's just a general perception. And so my question is for fishing. What are your perceptions? Do they engage well on the biodiversity climate agenda? From what I've seen, sometimes there are some complaints or around fishing stocks. So just wanted to, just a general question to understand that. Thank you.
I think there is a very interesting question, because I mean we know this actually the climate change impact is kicking in. We've seen that in the fisheries as well as in marine conservation, coral bleaching, for example, and there is the rapid changes, if you will, on the movement of the fish. This is also what I've learned from the community. The traditional communities in Indonesia, and that they have to move every other year if you will, to chase their target species, because the species tend to move already into a different fishing ground. So that is actually happening. But really the challenges is for us, how can we sort of translate it there into something practical that will actually help us to manage the fishery effectively, especially in the context of fishery again. And again, this is the importance of being able to be inclusive. I mean, in that the science will also need to talk to the government as well as the people, because no matter how best design you can have, if it is not implementable, if it is not compatible, if you will, the practice of the local people, then you will need to spend a lot of money to enforce your rule regulation, and it may not doable, right? So this is the balance that we need to find, if you will, in my experience.
I'll just say quickly from the U.S. context in terms of how we see the fishing industry in relationship to climate change. It's really issues like shifting stocks, weird things going on in the ocean, and there seems to be kind of two camps. One is, well, fishing doesn't impact it because climate change is what's messing things up, and therefore we should have more flexible regulations. And then there's another part where people are very much getting behind policies that support climate resilient fisheries, so resiliency in the face of this change, and so that's kind of the two dynamics in the U.S.
Okay, I got a question since I see a pause of questions, and then I'm going to direct this one to you. So, I'm a conservationist. I'm like, protect now, we'll worry about the details later. So, often called a precautionary approach. As a scientist, what is your take on the precautionary approach, and in particular related to these impacts?
Well, I think the student we need to start now. Actually, you could say we needed to start yesterday. You have to have baseline data when you want to understand how something changes, right? And so I think it's there's no reason to wait, right? The sooner the better. Again, it would have been it's better if it were already going. So the only way if we can get data and put it in context is if we have the baseline to compare to. So I think that's good.
Other questions from the audience?
Yes, you mentioned David McCauley with Jeff, among others. And I'm just wondering, you mentioned the biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions coming in impact. If you were looking back 5 years from now, what would you like to see in terms of impact?
For the mesopelagic zone in particular, or more general?
Yeah, so I will say a few things. One is marine protected areas on high seas, including the mesopelagic zone, is going to be really important. The other thing is a functional working relationship between the BB&J and the regional fishery management organizations. I covered the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission, and certainly BB&J is kind of seems like this scary thing on the horizon, and I don't think it has to be that way. I mean, they're charged with managing tuna stocks. In this particular case, these tunas are dependent upon these aquatic species for prey. So there needs to be a way they can work together because they don't necessarily have the competencies for protection of these aquatic zones. But the BB&J, I think, adds a nice tool to the toolbox for those two entities to work together to put protection in place. So I think that's critical. And then the environmental impact assessment, that's just critical, especially for something like this where we don't know and we need to look before we leave. But it's critical that that's put in place for any activities we pursue on the high seas.
So all from a more general high level perspective, like what would my idea be? All of the mesopelagic zone is in a precautionary clause. Until we get baseline data in place, until we know how to measure it and all of that, like let's start with protection. And then we can figure out if, when, how we can responsibly extract. And we have to work through the BB&J, you have to work through NORMA, you have to work through countries. Like it's a full court press. But essentially we want to flip the script, as we often say, and like put the burden of proof on the people that want to use it. And like, so let's start with protection. And then we can go through.
Just on that point, Katie, we are in the context of intergovernmental negotiations, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And as you know, David, better than anybody, these negotiations end up being a compromise between competing interests. Countries from the developed world have emphasized conservation to the exclusion of development. Developing countries try to do exactly the opposite. They say that we have our interest. So the question is not about either or, but both. How do we do that? And I think we have the skill sets, the knowledge base to at least make a beginning on that. We need to learn a lot more, and then we showed you this video of the Ocean Twilight Zone, the immersive theater that we have in Washington, D.C. We showcase not that beautiful thing, but a portion of that on the UN Secretariat wall at the high-level segment of the UN General Assembly. Folks just did not know anything about it. They said, is it true? I mean, it was that kind of a situation. So we need to provide that knowledge base so they understand what is the implication of safeguarding the mesopelagic zone for fisheries, for climate, for biodiversity, for all the things that we depend on and count on and then have these international agreements, but we need to make sure that it is both conservation and effective management of the resources is taken into account.
Other questions? All right, well, I've got more questions, so I'm going to keep going. So, what groundbreaking discoveries or technologies did y'all develop to help, actually build this knowledge? It's really pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, well, some of the things that we've been finding are, like we've been working a lot with the environmental DNA approach, and we find that when we use this approach, we find a lot of species that we were missing with the nets. Now we know that there's a lot of animals that nets miss, a lot of fish or other animals that are fast swimmers, for example, can avoid getting caught. Gelatinous animals may fall apart and turn to goo, and so they're underestimated. Nets don't really sample for microbes either. So when we look at our eDNA and we compare that with nets, we find that we're touching a whole lot of things that we're missing. Similarly, too, we've done some studies where we've looked at the gut contents of predatory fish, like the tunas and the swordfish, and we can see even in their stomachs, we're seeing prey items that we're missing with the net. So I think what we're learning is there's a lot more down there that we need to, start studying. We've actually spent a lot of focus on mesopelagic fishes, and we actually just put out a reference library with genetic markers for 80 species of mesopelagic fishes, 2 different markers, and all from the Northwest Atlantic. And so So that's another really big accomplishment that we've done. So I could go on, but I'll pass on.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I want to mention is the MISO you referred to that. And the neatest technology there is completely developed inside, the institution. And, Kalina Grab here is a product of a joint program, a doctoral program with MIT. And these the MIT who is student, developed a lot of this neat technology for various things. Something that costs $50,000, they will produce it for $500,000. Doesn't last as long as the $50,000 one, but you can have many of them in a lot more, to go a lot longer. So lots of technology.
Great stuff. Let's talk to stakeholders and getting people involved. So this is mostly for Roman Abdul. Let's start at the big level: governments, international organizations, scientists. How do you think they should be involved, engaged in the conservation of the marine twilight zone? What's the opportunity there? And then I'll follow up with you, Googling about the local piece and how should they be engaged in, protection of a zone that's, not immediately within their reach.
Yeah. Thanks, Katie, for the question. I started my life at the Oceanographic Institution as a young fellow coming from Harvard Law School. And at the time, I was interested in South Asian seas, to have a protected a convention, a regional agreement along the regional seas agreement. And then, of course, I've gone on to doing various other things. But when I came back to Woods Hole, the one question is, so the other things I mentioned was working for the UN and working with the Green Climate Fund and other places. The question is, why is ocean not playing the kind of part that it should be playing? So when we came to, and it is a fortunate circumstance because Peter Diminokel became president of the Oceanographic. He came from Columbia University, and he was given the task of actually connecting ocean to climate solution. So it just so happened that I came to Woods Hole at the same time as he became president, and so he asked me if I would come and contribute. So the first thing to do, of course, is building partnerships. It is absolutely vital. So what happened was the climate convention did not talk about ocean for the longest period. Even Paris Climate Agreement had only a passing mention of it in the preamble. So Glasgow Climate Summit decided to establish Ocean Climate Dialogue. And I had the good fortune of being asked to moderate the discussion amongst the member countries. And what we have discovered in that was how little is known to member countries about what oceans do. They never thought of including them in their NDCs. They never thought of including them in any of the national reporting that they do, etc. So that's the first part. So immediately after I had the opportunity to moderate the discussion in the Unit 323, we decided to establish Ocean Pavilion in the Blue Zone. We started in the Sharm el-Sheikh, the conference immediately after Glasgow, and we brought in, there are several of you right here, including the Blue Marine Foundation, Ocean Policy Research Institute, and the Environmental Defense Fund, various others, our partners. And not only that, our friends from Colombia here as well, all of them have come together and said, well, we've been talking about ocean being ignored, now is the time to really make that. So the first point is partnership, and partnerships with leading oceanographic institutions and philanthropic foundations. And that is the reason why when we went to Dubai, for the second iteration of the Ocean Pavilion, Bloomberg Philanthropies came and announced $350 million for ocean work. And that is continuing. So what we need to do in addition to climate, we cannot just say ocean is being ignored in climate, but the ocean across all the multilateral environmental agreement, we need to think about doing that. And what we are trying to do here is exactly that. So you would be surprised at the number of events that are being held today, tomorrow, and the day after on ocean. And about 4 to 5 months ago, when we started talking about having one day, it was a hard sell. The Convention on Biological Diversity Secretary said, we have a full agenda. We can't really devote time or give space for this. But now, it is coming up. So the same thing will happen with other things, and we have to continue doing these things and only then. And we need to break the silos, build partnerships, bring knowledge to bear on policy making, and make sure that no matter what we do, we are not causing ancillary problems in solving one problem. and so we need to be very mindful of that. So the precautionary principle is extremely useful. And I think we are getting to a point where we are making progress. And I think our partnership, this event and what we're going to do in the future is really a way forward in terms of making those links. Great.
Thank you very much. So, I'm not sure. You may or may not surprise actually on how far the traditional community can wander in the oceans using the traditional sailboats. So, for example, in Indonesia, there is one tribe that is residing in Isthmus Tenggara, if you will, that actually has a special fishing allocation in the waters bordering Australia. So this actually tells you how far they actually can go. The reason why they have this special allocation in that particular oceans because they able to prove that actually there's been the fishing rod that they discovered and been using from generation to generation. So the point is actually that the knowledge of the traditional community people is actually very invaluable, very, very important. And I've been doing, I've been a conservation practitioner for many, few decades anyway. And I realized that actually the best thing you do before, when you enter the new places to start your project is actually asking around to the fisher who's been living there for decades, and this actually saves you a lot. You don't have to go anywhere surveying. You actually can start doing the thing from what you have heard from them because they know what is happening, in that area. Not only actually in the area next to their village, but even far away. That's the example that I have told you to what is bordering Indonesia and Australia. So it's very important to listen to them, and I have them also. I gave them the opportunity to talk when people make decisions.
Great. Let's turn to the national level, since CBD, COP, all of that was made up of parties of nations. So we know about BBJ, the RFMOs, the DBNJ. Chris, could you talk a little bit about what nations may be able to do to get going their own EEZ?
Yeah, so nations can do a lot in terms of within their EEZs, and I'll give you one example in the U.S. So in the U.S., there are a couple of regions where actions were taken through the fishery management process to protect certain classes of mesopelagic species. And the reason is because they are forage for commercially and recreationally important species. So no existing fisheries, and fishery managers are like, look, someone may come in and want to fish these species that are going to harm ones we care about. So they were able to put essentially a precautionary clause in place that there's no fishing on these species unless and until we can determine how fishing for these species is going to impact those that are of importance to communities.
Maybe a question and a comment on that. Susanna Fuller from Ocean Twilight in Canada. One thing that we've been successful at, we didn't even know we were successful at time, was in the blue whale recovery plan. We made sure that fisheries for their prey could not start because it was going to impact their recovery. So I'm just wondering if there's some thinking about how do we use the top of the food chain that people know about, care about, and you talked a little bit about tuna, but is there a narrative there that uses, the sexy megafauna to actually get that message out a little bit in a different way?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. Given the charismatic megafauna that feed in the mesopelagic zone, I think this can really resonate with a lot of different audiences. So for the fishing industry, species they care about, but for people that care about whales and dolphins, for example, they're also important consumers of mesopelagic species. And so absolutely. And the more we learn about the mesopelagic side, the more we understand that there are even more species dependent upon the zone. So absolutely, I think it's going to be an important part of making the case for why protection is necessary.
All right. I'll bring us to the close then. So just so you all know, this is a very timely discussion. We're going to do a little processy, just in case we have any parties here who may be able to help out. CBD Secretariat on the Alignment and Local Diversity Framework around the Marine Biodiversity Program identified the need to improve the understanding of mesopelagic species and ecosystems to ensure sustainable management of living marine resources. So this is an active thing that the CBD Secretariat is trying to figure out. There is language that's being negotiated right now, and mesopelagic is in some versions and not in others. So if y'all have some influence in the negotiations, we would certainly appreciate any advocacy you can have to make sure mesopelagic stays on the radar screen for the CBD program. So if you want to be allies, we would certainly appreciate it all. Again, thank you to Chimney for hosting. Thank you all for coming out to learn more about the mesopelagic zone. And we have some refreshments in the back. So thanks for coming.